What began as a routine discussion gradually shifted into an on-air moment viewers did not anticipate. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not through shouting or spectacle, but through firm disagreement expressed in real time, with cameras rolling and an audience watching every reaction. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular morning episode of The View, the atmosphere initially felt familiar and steady, the kind of opening that longtime viewers have seen countless times. The hosts were seated at the table, coffee mugs in place, audience applause settling down as the introduction wrapped. Matthew McConaughey was welcomed as the guest of the day, greeted warmly by the panel and the studio audience. His appearance was framed as part of a broader conversation about his recent public comments, his work outside of acting, and his views on civic responsibility, topics that had already generated discussion online in the days leading up to the show. From the very beginning, McConaughey carried himself with his usual calm demeanor. He leaned back slightly in his chair, hands resting comfortably, offering thoughtful smiles as the host spoke. His tone was measured, conversational, and respectful, fitting neatly into the daytime talk show rhythm. The early part of the discussion stayed light, touching briefly on his career, his family life, and how he balances personal values with public visibility. The audience responded with gentle laughter and nods, the kind of engagement that signals comfort rather than anticipation of conflict. As the conversation gradually shifted, the hosts began steering toward more serious ground. Sonny Hostin introduced a topic connected to comments McConaughey had made in previous interviews about responsibility, personal choice, and the role of public figures in social debates. Her question was delivered in a composed, professional tone, but it carried a clear point of view. She referenced broader social conversations happening across the country and asked McConaughey how he reconciled his emphasis on personal accountability with systemic issues that many argue require collective solutions. At first, McConaughey responded in a reflective way, choosing his words carefully. He spoke about listening, about the importance of understanding multiple perspectives, and about his belief that dialogue matters more than division. As he talked, he maintained steady eye contact with Sonny, occasionally glancing at the other hosts, signaling openness rather than defensiveness. The panel remained quiet, allowing him space to finish his thoughts, which is often a sign that the conversation is entering more serious territory. Sonny then followed up, gently but directly. She acknowledged his points but pushed back, suggesting that his framing might overlook the lived experiences of certain communities. Her voice stayed even, but her posture shifted forward slightly, hands moving as she emphasized her words. The studio audience reacted with a low murmur, not applause or gasps, but that subtle sound that indicates attention sharpening. This was no longer a surface-level exchange. McConaughey listened without interrupting, nodding once or twice as she spoke. When it was his turn to respond, his tone remained calm, but there was a noticeable firmness that hadn't been present earlier. He straightened in his chair, folded his hands briefly, and began by clarifying his position. He explained that acknowledging systemic challenges does not, in his view, negate the importance of individual responsibility. He stressed that the two ideas could coexist, and that framing them as opposites often leads to misunderstanding rather than progress. As he spoke, the pacing of the show subtly changed. The hosts who weren't speaking leaned back, watching closely. One nodded along, another glanced toward the audience, sensing the shift in energy. The camera lingered slightly longer on McConaughey's face, capturing the seriousness in his expression. He wasn't raising his voice or using dramatic language, but the conviction in his delivery was clear. Sonny responded again, this time more pointedly, questioning whether public figures should be more explicit when discussing systemic issues, especially given their influence. She emphasized accountability at a societal level, her words deliberate and precise. The exchange remained respectful, but the disagreement was now clearly defined. The audience stayed quiet, indicating that they were processing the exchange rather than reacting emotionally. McConaughey replied firmly, but without hostility. He acknowledged her concern and said he understood why people wanted clearer statements from those in the public eye. He then explained that his approach was intentional, rooted in his belief that oversimplified messaging can sometimes do more harm than good. He spoke about encouraging critical thinking rather than prescribing conclusions, a point that drew a few scattered nods from the audience. At this stage, the tension wasn't explosive, but it was unmistakable. The rhythm of casual daytime conversation had given way to something more deliberate. The hosts allowed the discussion to continue without cutting to commercial, a decision that often signals the producers recognize the importance of the moment. Body language around the table reflected attentiveness rather than discomfort, suggesting that while the exchange was firm, it was still within the boundaries of productive dialogue. One of the co-hosts briefly interjected, not to take sides, but to summarize what had been said so far, a common technique used on the show to keep the conversation accessible to viewers. This helped reset the pacing slightly, giving both Sunny and McConaughey a moment to breathe. McConaughey nodded appreciatively, while Sunny maintained a focused expression, clearly prepared to continue. As part one of this conversation unfolded, it became clear to viewers that this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about two people with different perspectives engaging in a real-time exchange under the bright lights of live television. The firmness in McConaughey's responses didn't come from aggression, but from clarity. Sunny's persistence didn't come from confrontation, but from conviction. The stage was set for the discussion to deepen further, with the audience fully aware that they were witnessing a genuine moment of disagreement handled in a controlled, professional manner, exactly as daytime television often intends when it opens space for serious conversation. As the conversation moved forward, the tone settled into something more deliberate and focused, the kind of atmosphere that viewers of daytime talk shows immediately recognize as meaningful but still controlled. There was no rush to move on, no quick jokes to lighten the mood. Instead, the hosts allowed the discussion to breathe. The camera alternated between Sunny Hostin and Matthew McConaughey, occasionally cutting to reaction shots from the other panelists, whose expressions reflected careful listening rather than anticipation of conflict. Sunny resumed by expanding on her earlier point, explaining that for many viewers, especially those directly affected by the issues being discussed, language matters deeply. She spoke about how public conversations shape perception and policy, and how nuance, while valuable, can sometimes feel distant to people looking for acknowledgement of their realities. Her voice remained steady, but there was an emotional undercurrent that came through in her facial expressions and hand movements. She wasn't speaking abstractly. She was grounding her argument in the experiences she regularly brings to the table on the show. McConaughey listened closely, his posture relaxed but attentive. He waited until she finished completely before responding, a pause that felt intentional rather than hesitant. When he began to speak, he started by acknowledging her perspective directly, saying that he respected where she was coming from and understood why clarity and specificity are important. That acknowledgement softened the space slightly, and a few members of the studio audience nodded, responding to the tone of mutual respect. He then clarified his stance further, explaining that his concern lies in how conversations can become polarized when complex issues are reduced to simplified talking points. He spoke about his belief in encouraging people to engage deeply, to question their own assumptions, and to take ownership of their role in shaping society, even while recognizing larger systemic forces. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in his cadence, a subtle emphasis on certain words that signaled how strongly he felt about this balance. At this point, one of the other hosts briefly leaned in, offering a short comment that framed the exchange as a reflection of a broader national conversation. She pointed out that many viewers at home likely see themselves in both perspectives being presented. This interjection didn't interrupt the flow, but instead widened the lens, reminding the audience that this wasn't a personal disagreement so much as a public dialogue playing out live. Sunny responded to McConaughey's explanation by pressing on a specific example, referencing moments when public figures' reluctance to take firm stances has been criticized. Her tone remained professional, but her questions became more pointed. She asked whether there are times when choosing not to be explicit can itself be interpreted as a stance. The studio audience reacted with a low murmur, signaling that the question resonated. McConaughey took a breath before answering, a small but noticeable pause that the camera caught. When he spoke, he did so carefully, choosing words that reflected both conviction and restraint. He said that he believes intention matters, and that his intention has always been to bring people into conversation rather than draw lines that force them into opposing camps. He emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean dismissal, and that his goal is often to create space for dialogue rather than close it with definitive statements. The pacing of the show slowed even further as this exchange continued. There were no overlapping voices, no interruptions beyond gentle clarifications. This was a moment where the show leaned into its role as a forum for discussion rather than entertainment. The other hosts remained mostly silent, their body language open, hands folded or resting on the table, eyes moving between the speakers. Sonny, maintaining eye contact, acknowledged his explanation but pointed out that for some audiences, especially those who feel unheard, ambiguity can feel frustrating. She spoke about the responsibility that comes with a large platform and how viewers often look to public figures for guidance or validation. Her delivery was firm but composed, reflecting a sense of duty rather than confrontation. McConaughey responded by agreeing that platforms come with responsibility, but he drew a distinction between responsibility and prescription. He explained that he doesn't see his role as telling people what to think, but rather encouraging them to think for themselves. His hands moved subtly as he spoke, palms open, a gesture that suggested openness rather than defensiveness. He reiterated that acknowledging systemic challenges and promoting personal agency are not mutually exclusive, and that meaningful change often requires both. As he finished his thought, there was a brief, quiet pause. The audience remained silent, not out of discomfort, but out of attentiveness. Then a few scattered claps emerged, restrained but supportive, reflecting appreciation for the tone of the exchange rather than endorsement of one side over the other. The hosts allowed the applause to settle naturally before continuing. Another panelist chimed in briefly, noting that what viewers were seeing was a rare example of disagreement handled without escalation. She remarked on the importance of modeling respectful discourse, especially in a media environment often dominated by extremes. This comment subtly reframed the moment, shifting focus from the content of the disagreement to the manner in which it was being conducted. Sunny nodded in response, and when she spoke again, her tone softened slightly. She clarified that her intention wasn't to dismiss McConaughey's perspective, but to highlight the real-world impact of public messaging. She emphasized that these conversations matter because they influence how people understand their place in society. Her words were deliberate, reflective, and clearly rooted in her role as both a legal analyst and a talk show host. McConaughey acknowledged this clarification with a small nod and a brief smile. He responded by saying that he appreciated the conversation and welcomed the challenge. He noted that being questioned in this way was part of engaging honestly with complex topics. His firmness remained, but it was paired with an evident respect for the process itself. The exchange had now settled into a rhythm of thoughtful back and forth, each response building on the last rather than escalating. The studio audience followed closely, their reactions minimal but engaged. The show's pacing suggested that producers were allowing this segment to run its course naturally, recognizing that viewers at home were likely leaning in rather than tuning out. By the end of this portion of the discussion, it was clear that neither side was backing away from their core beliefs. However, it was equally clear that the disagreement was being handled with professionalism and restraint. The conversation had deepened, moving beyond surface-level talking points into a more nuanced exploration of responsibility, influence, and dialogue. As the cameras continued to roll, viewers could sense that the exchange was far from over, and that the most defining moments of the discussion were still unfolding. As the discussion continued, there was a subtle but noticeable shift in how everyone at the table engaged. The initial careful pacing gave way to a slightly more direct exchange, not louder or more emotional, but more focused. The hosts seemed aware that viewers were deeply invested now, and the conversation reflected that awareness. The camera lingered a bit longer on facial expressions, catching small reactions that might otherwise go unnoticed during lighter segments. Sunny Hostin resumed by narrowing in on the practical implications of what had been discussed. She spoke about how conversations like this translate beyond television into policy debates, classrooms, and dinner tables across the country. Her point was not framed as a challenge to McConaughey personally, but as a question about impact. She asked how he measures whether his approach to public dialogue actually reaches the people who need it most. McConaughey listened with his head slightly tilted, eyes fixed on Sunny as she spoke. When she finished, he responded without hesitation, but still with a measured tone. He explained that he doesn't see influence as something that can be easily quantified. Instead, he looks for signs of engagement, moments where people are willing to listen to each other even when they disagree. He talked about conversations he's had with people from different backgrounds, and how those exchanges reinforced his belief that progress often starts with understanding rather than alignment. One of the co-hosts interjected briefly, asking whether that approach risks being too slow in moments when urgency feels necessary. The question added another layer to the discussion, and McConaughey acknowledged it with a thoughtful pause. He said that urgency has its place, but that lasting change often requires patience. He emphasized that reactionary responses can sometimes create resistance, whereas steady dialogue can open doors over time. Sunny responded by pointing out that patience can feel like a luxury to those facing immediate challenges. Her tone remained calm, but her words carried weight. She spoke about the emotional toll of waiting for incremental change and how that frustration often fuels public demands for stronger, clearer stances from influential voices. The audience reacted quietly, with a few nods and murmurs indicating recognition. McConaughey replied firmly, clarifying that he wasn't advocating for inaction. He stressed that acknowledging urgency doesn't mean abandoning nuance. He spoke about acting thoughtfully rather than impulsively, and about how he tries to balance empathy with responsibility in his public statements. His voice remained even, but there was a noticeable emphasis in his phrasing, signaling that this distinction mattered deeply to him. At this point, the exchange felt less like a back and forth and more like a layered conversation, with each response adding context rather than contradicting outright. The hosts allowed the dialogue to unfold without interruption, a sign that the moment had become central to the segment. The studio audience stayed attentive, their reactions minimal but engaged, reflecting the seriousness of the topic. Sunny leaned back slightly before continuing, her posture suggesting a moment of reflection. When she spoke again, she acknowledged McConaughey's consistency, noting that his position had remained steady throughout the discussion. She then asked whether he felt misunderstood when his comments were interpreted as avoiding commitment. The question shifted the tone subtly, inviting a more personal reflection without turning the conversation inward too dramatically. McConaughey answered candidly, saying that misunderstanding comes with visibility. He explained that once comments are taken out of context, they can be framed in ways that don't reflect the original intent. He said that while he can't control every interpretation, he can remain consistent in how he communicates. His response was calm, but there was a firmness in his acknowledgement that misinterpretation is part of public life. Another host added a short comment about how media cycles often amplify extremes, making measured positions harder to hear. This observation resonated with the audience, drawing a brief ripple of applause. The comment seemed to momentarily align the panel, easing the tension without resolving the underlying disagreement. Sunny nodded in agreement with that point, then returned to her central concern. She emphasized that clarity and nuance don't have to be mutually exclusive, and that audiences often look for both. Her tone was less pointed now, more explanatory, as if summarizing rather than challenging. She spoke about the responsibility of talk shows themselves to facilitate these kinds of conversations in a way that informs rather than inflames. McConaughey responded by expressing appreciation for the platform and for the nature of the discussion taking place. He said that conversations like this, even when they involve disagreement, are valuable precisely because they happen in a public space where viewers can hear multiple perspectives. He reiterated that firmness in one's beliefs doesn't require dismissing others, a point that seemed to encapsulate his approach throughout the segment. The pacing of the show remained steady, but there was a sense that the conversation was approaching a turning point. The disagreement hadn't escalated, but it had been fully explored from multiple angles. The hosts began to subtly guide the discussion toward broader reflections, signaling that the segment would eventually need to transition. Sunny made one final point in this portion of the exchange, emphasizing that while she and McConaughey may approach public discourse differently, the goal of progress is shared. Her delivery was composed and clear, and she maintained eye contact as she spoke. The audience responded with a small but audible round of applause, acknowledging the sentiment. McConaughey nodded in response, agreeing that shared goals often exist beneath surface-level disagreements. He reiterated that firm responses don't have to be confrontational, and that respectful disagreement can be productive. His closing remarks in this part were concise, signaling that he was comfortable where the conversation had landed so far. As the cameras continued to roll, it was evident that what viewers were witnessing was not a moment of spectacle, but an example of real-time discourse unfolding under the constraints of live television. The disagreement had been firm at moments, particularly in how each articulated responsibility and influence, but it remained grounded. The stage was set for the conversation to move toward resolution, or at least reflection, as the segment progressed toward its final moments. As the conversation moved into its later phase, there was a noticeable sense of settling at the table, as if everyone involved recognized that the core points had been clearly stated. The energy shifted from probing and challenging toward reflection and synthesis. This is often the point in a live daytime segment where discussions either cool down or risk reigniting, and the hosts appeared attentive to keeping the tone steady and constructive. One of the co-hosts gently reframed the discussion by asking how conversations like this can be made more accessible to viewers who may feel overwhelmed by complexity. The question wasn't directed solely at McConaughey or Sonny, but to the panel as a whole. It functioned as a bridge, inviting both perspectives to connect with the audience at home. The studio audience reacted with quiet approval, signaling that the question resonated beyond the table. Sonny answered first, speaking about the importance of grounding conversations in real experiences. She explained that while policy language and abstract ideas are important, people often connect most deeply when they hear how issues affect daily life. Her tone was calm and explanatory, and she spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to translating complex topics for a broad audience. As she talked, her gestures were measured, reinforcing her points without urgency. McConaughey followed, building on her response rather than opposing it. He agreed that accessibility matters and said that one of his goals in public conversations is to encourage people to see themselves as part of the solution. He emphasized storytelling as a way to make ideas relatable, noting that when people recognize their own experiences in a discussion, they're more likely to engage thoughtfully. His voice remained steady and his posture relaxed, signaling that the tension had eased. At this point, the disagreement that had defined the earlier parts of the segment softened into something more collaborative. The hosts exchanged brief glances, acknowledging the shift. One of them commented on how the exchange reflected the kind of dialogue many people hope to see more often, especially on issues that don't have simple answers. This remark drew light applause from the audience, reinforcing the sense that the moment was being received positively. Sonny nodded and added that respectful disagreement doesn't mean abandoning accountability. She reiterated that pressing for clarity is part of her role on the show, especially when discussing topics with real-world consequences. Her tone was firm but not confrontational, and she framed her earlier questions as part of that responsibility. The way she spoke suggested closure rather than continuation of the challenge. McConaughey responded by acknowledging that role directly. He said he appreciated being questioned and understood why Sonny pushed for specificity. He clarified that his firm responses were not meant to deflect, but to articulate his position as honestly as possible. This acknowledgement was met with a brief but audible response from the audience, a sign that viewers appreciated the transparency. The pacing of the segment began to quicken slightly as producers prepared to move toward a wrap-up. The hosts started to summarize key points, a common practice that helps viewers who may have joined mid-segment. They highlighted the shared emphasis on responsibility, the difference in approach, and the importance of ongoing conversation. This recap helped contextualize the disagreement without reigniting it. Sonny offered a final reflection in this portion, noting that conversations like this are rarely about changing minds instantly. Instead, she said they're about planting ideas and encouraging reflection. Her voice was calm, and her expression softened, signaling that she felt the discussion had been productive. The audience responded with a gentle round of applause, acknowledging the sentiment. McConaughey echoed that thought, saying that if people leave the conversation thinking a bit more deeply, then it's been worthwhile. He emphasized that firmness and openness can coexist, and that engaging respectfully is often more impactful than trying to persuade forcefully. His words were measured and concise, fitting naturally into the tone of the show. Another host briefly thanked both of them for keeping the conversation thoughtful and civil. This kind of acknowledgement often signals that a segment is nearing its conclusion, and the body language around the table reflected that understanding. Coffee mugs were adjusted, notes were glanced at, and the overall posture of the panel relaxed. As the cameras captured the final moments of this exchange, it was clear that the disagreement had evolved into mutual recognition. While Sonny and McConaughey had not fully aligned in their perspectives, they had articulated their differences clearly and respectfully. The studio audience remained engaged, their reactions subdued but positive, reflecting appreciation for a conversation that stayed grounded and real. The segment was now poised to transition, with the hosts preparing to either move to a commercial break or shift topics. Viewers at home had been given a full arc of discussion, from initial tension to thoughtful reflection. The firmness in McConaughey's responses had been balanced by Sonny's persistence, resulting in a moment that felt authentic to the format of daytime television rather than performative. As Part 4 drew to a close, the atmosphere in the studio felt calmer, more reflective than at the start of the exchange. The disagreement had run its course without escalation, leaving space for final thoughts and reactions that would shape how the moment was remembered once the episode ended. As the segment moved toward its conclusion, the hosts naturally began guiding the conversation to a close, mindful of time and the broader flow of the show. The energy at the table was noticeably calmer than earlier, not because the disagreement had disappeared, but because it had been fully explored. This was the point where live television often shifts from debate to reflection, allowing viewers to absorb what they've heard before moving on. One of the co-hosts offered a brief summary of the discussion, highlighting that while perspectives differed, the exchange itself demonstrated the value of open conversation. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to lead to division, a point that felt consistent with the tone the segment had ultimately reached. The studio audience responded with steady applause, not loud or celebratory, but appreciative. Sunny Hostin gave her final remarks by reiterating that her questions came from a place of concern for how public dialogue shapes real-world outcomes. She spoke calmly, her posture relaxed, and made it clear that pressing guests on difficult topics is part of her responsibility on the show. She thanked McConaughey for engaging directly rather than deflecting, a comment that acknowledged the firmness of his responses without framing them as combative. McConaughey responded with equal composure. He thanked the panel for allowing space for a real discussion and said he valued being part of conversations that don't shy away from complexity. He noted that while not everyone will agree with his approach, he stands by the importance of listening and thoughtful engagement. His tone remained steady, and his body language reflected closure rather than continuation. As the final words were exchanged, the studio audience applauded again, this time a bit more fully. The applause carried a sense of resolution, signaling that viewers in the room felt the discussion had reached a natural endpoint. The camera pulled back slightly, capturing the entire table as the hosts prepared to transition to the next segment. Once the episode aired, the exchange quickly became a topic of conversation among viewers. On social media, reactions reflected the same range of perspectives seen at the table. Some praised Sunny Hostin for pressing the issue and representing concerns they felt were often overlooked. Others supported McConaughey, describing his responses as measured, respectful, and firm without being dismissive. Many viewers commented less on who was right and more on how the conversation was handled. Clips from the segment circulated online, with particular attention paid to the moments where McConaughey clarified his position and Sunny pushed for greater specificity. Commentators noted the absence of shouting or personal attacks, pointing out that the exchange stood out precisely because it remained calm. Several media outlets referenced the segment as an example of daytime television, hosting a serious conversation without turning it into spectacle. Following the show, the hosts briefly addressed the discussion during off-air interviews and online posts, reiterating that the goal was to encourage thoughtful dialogue. Sunny clarified that her questions were intended to reflect concerns raised by viewers, while McConaughey shared that he appreciated the opportunity to explain his perspective in a live setting. These follow-up comments helped contextualize the exchange and reinforced that no personal conflict existed beyond the discussion itself. In the days that followed, the segment continued to be referenced in conversations about media responsibility and public discourse. Viewers who watched live often remarked that the moment felt authentic, like something unfolding naturally rather than being manufactured for attention. The steady pacing, respectful tone, and clear disagreement made it memorable without being inflammatory. As the episode faded from the immediate news cycle, it remained an example of how firm disagreement can exist within professional boundaries on daytime television. The exchange between Matthew McConaughey and Sunny Hostin didn't end with a definitive conclusion, but with mutual acknowledgement and a shared understanding of the importance of conversation itself. And now we want to hear from you. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.